Welcome back, everyone. This is the second video in a series that relates to your final project. Alright, so if you haven't done so already, I would pull up the data that you were working with last week. Just have another look at it. So last week what I had you do was just work with the violent crime data. I showed you what I wanted you to do with the property crime data. We won't look at property crime for the final project. We'll just continue to look at violent crime. So we'll present the results of our weighted displacement quotient that you did last week in our presentation. But what we are going to do is we're going to look at the outputs, right? So we're going to look at what officers actually did during the intervention. So the first important thing to note, what I'd like you to do is to change a variable heading. So in your data you have pre and during SQF, which stands for stop, question, and frisks, and you also have pre and during, and what your data are going to say are PEDs, or pedestrian stops. Well, SQF and PEDs are the same thing. I meant to call this, or label these data, car stops. So first thing to do is get rid of PEDs and replace PEDs with cars. Right, so pre-cars and then during cars. And so we'll continue to assume that these are car stops. So what we're saying is that in this sector, which is a treatment sector, we had 8 car stops before the intervention, and then we had 10 car stops during the intervention. We also have these variables for arrests. So we've got the number of arrests that occurred before the intervention, the number that occurred during it, stop, question, and frisk. We've got the number of SQFs that occurred before the intervention and the number of SQFs that occurred during the intervention. So what we're going to do first in our presentation is we're going to go ahead and show these different outputs for the treatment and comparison groups as a whole. Right, so what you'll need to do then is to repeat what you did with the pivot tables last week. Alright, so just to give you a refresher, in your Excel file you should have a tab that says Violent Crime Analysis, and this is what I looked at in terms of last week's in-class assignment. So you came up with the counts of crime for the target, control, and buffer locations. So you filled these in, you entered the results for the amount of crime in the target, buffer, and control area, the success measure, displacement measure, and total net effect, and then I had you write up a summary. Right? So this tab should already be completed because you did this last week. And where we got these numbers from, right, this target, pre-intervention, and during intervention violent crime counts, is we looked at pivot tables. Right? So we used the pivot tables to come up with these. So if you need a refresher of what you did last week, just go ahead and have a look at those videos. What I'm showing you right now is what I did, or the analysis that I did to fill in my PowerPoint. So whereas we did this pivot table for violent crime in the control and treatment areas before and during the intervention, what I've got up here right now are the number of stop, question, and frisks that occurred both before and during the intervention, and I have it separated for the control and treatment group. So what I did was I ticked my box for condition, which gave me the control and treatment group rows, and then I pulled down pre-SQF and during SQF into this values box, which calculated the number for both the treatment and control groups separately, before and during the intervention separately. And remember that I had to go ahead and go to this value settings box, and the default is count. And so if you just keep the default, you'll have 8 in here. So you'll have 8 control, 8 treatment, and that's because we've got 16 sectors, half for treatment and half for control, and so that's why it would be showing 8. What you want to do is choose sum, which I've already done, and click OK, and that's where it's actually going to count for you the number of stop, question, and frisks that occurred before and during the intervention. And so after I did this, all that I did was then enter this information in my PowerPoint. Right, so I've got pedestrian stops. Remember, SQF and pedestrian stops, terms that mean the same thing, use them interchangeably. So I've already done this slide for you, so you're not going to have to do this for your presentation. The pedestrian stop slide, which will be your third slide, is completed for you. And so what I did was I took the numbers that were included in my Excel file, right? So both started at 118 before the intervention. However, in the control area we had 107 SQFs during, and in the treatment areas we had 151 SQFs during. And so what I did was I entered that information in my chart, and this is relatively simple to do. All you've got to do is right click, choose Edit Data, select that Edit Data tab, and an Excel type spreadsheet will pop up. And so this is the data that is underlying this particular chart. And so all you have to do is change the values here. So I already did this. I changed whatever was filled in here before to 151, and I changed whatever was filled in here before to 107. Right, so now I've got the correct data in here for my pedestrian stops. But another thing that I had to do was change the scale. So the scale that's currently, or that was in here for this slide, is the same that is in your detected drug activity slide, which you'll have to change. So it started at 200, the vertical axis, and went up to 550 on the vertical axis. Well, if we started at 200 in this chart, 200 would be the first value, and what that means is that my lines wouldn't appear because I don't have any values that are above 200. And so I've got to change the scale here for the vertical axis. And so all you really have to do here is right click, select Format Chart Area. Right click on the actual axis, right click, Format Axis, and what's going to pop up here is this Format Axis Options. And so what you can then do is change the values, and I've already done this. So here on my vertical axis, the minimum is 100 and the maximum is 160, right? Because my lowest number here is 107, and so 100 is a good starting place for my axis, and then my highest is 151, and so 160 is appropriate here. And all I had to do was, again, right click, change the axis, and enter that information here. All right, so you will also have to do this for detected drug, this won't be a detected drug activity. What you'll do is you'll change this in your PowerPoint, and I'll make sure this is up in the PowerPoint that I post. This is going to be our vehicle stops, because we don't have detected drug activity in our data. All right, so this will say vehicle stops in the PowerPoint I provide you on Blackboard. All right, so you'll have to do a couple of things when you enter the vehicle stop data. So you're going to have to right click, edit data, and you're going to have to change the values here. And the values that you enter are going to correspond to what you get for vehicle stops in the data that I provided you, using the same process for generating that pivot table. And I'll go back to the pivot table and I'll show you how to do this one more time for vehicle stops. All right, so you'll have to enter this data here. Another thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to change the values that are reported here. Right, so I already clicked in these text boxes and I deleted the values that were there previously, and I entered 118. Right, so you want to make sure you change the values for each of your lines. Right, so you'll just click, delete 397, and enter whatever you've got pop up in your pivot table here for the comparison area before the patrols. Alright, so what I'll do is pull the Excel file back up. I'm going to uncheck stop question and frisks. Right, so we'll say that this is where you're going to start for your vehicle stops. Right, you've just got the condition box ticked. Then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to go and try to find. Oh, I've actually got to redo this because I changed the label in my data, but I had already created my pivot chart, and so I don't have yet the vehicle stop data. So what I'll do is I will go back to my pivot table, or my data, select it all, choose to insert a pivot table, and click OK. And so I'll have condition, which I'll tick, and now I have cars here. So what I'll do is I'll drag pre-cars down to the values field. I'll drag during cars down to the values field. I'll change the field setting from count to sum for each of those. And now you have all of the information that you need to enter into your PowerPoint. So for the control areas, before the intervention there were 129 car stops, and in the treatment areas there were 94. So what you'll do is you'll go back to your PowerPoint. And so we said, well, I gotta look because I forgot already, control 129, treatment 94. So I'll change this in my text box. And then during the intervention, I've got 102 in control and 131 in treatment. Alright, but remember, these are just labels, so these are just text boxes that I've already put in here. We also have to change the underlying data. And so what I'll do is I'll right click, edit data. And so here is where we're going to need to change the data for before patrols and during patrols for the target and comparison group. So before patrols, before our intervention in the target area, we had 94 vehicle stops. During, we had 131. In the comparison areas, we had 129 before, and then 102 during. But as I said, because of the way that our axis is currently formatted, if I enter this data, we're not going to see any lines because our starting value here is 200. Alright, so the lines are appearing under 200. So what we'll need to do is change the axis. And so we'll right click, format axis, and here we'll say that we started at 90, and we'll say 150. We'll keep 135. All right, so now we can see everything. Right now we can see our lines, and we've got the pre-intervention target area count, during intervention target area count, pre for the comparison, during for the comparison. We've got it labeled, and we've got our axis labeled. So you're going to have to repeat this. I'm not going to have this in your PowerPoint. You'll have to do this on your own. Another thing I want to point out is that I've got animations in here. And so what I'll have you do is click this Animations tab and then click Animation Pane. Now I'm not going to go over how to use animations. If we were in class I would. But there's all sorts of things that you can do in PowerPoint to make your presentations more professional. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to go back to last week's lecture videos and look at how I discuss the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment in terms of the different outputs that officers did during that experiment. So as I switch or progressed in slides, these lines automatically appeared. And so they automatically populate, and I could actually just play it for you. So when you switch to the slide, comparison area comes first, and my target area comes second, right? And they're automatically appearing on my screen. And that's because all I did was add animation. So I selected my line, I selected wipe, and then I changed the options under here. I'm just going to have you keep with what I have in terms of the animations for these slides. I just wanted to point it out for you, that the way that I had these lines appear separately and timed is through animations. And I did that so that when I'm talking about the intervention, this is happening behind me as I talk. And so my audience can listen to the words I say about what officers did, and they can also get this visual, and it's going to happen in real time. All right, so I'm going to end this second part here, and I'll pick up in the third part, and I'll continue on with what I'm expecting from the final project. So I will see you in video 3.